Hi, and thank you for joining us for this exciting discussion about the connection between STEM and the arts. I'm Francis Vigent, CEO here at KnowAtom. Thank you for joining us. And just to kind of kick off our discussion, I'd like to let you know a little bit about what KnowAtom is and also why we're talking about art if you're not familiar with it. So KnowAtom is an organization where educators that are focused on science, technology, engineering, and math and helping specifically public education classrooms not only meet the needs of policy, but really focus on creating a space where students are able to create, evaluate, and analyze simultaneously by putting them in the role of scientist and engineer and engaging them hands-on as scientists and engineers on an everyday basis. So why we're talking about art is really to consider that crossover between STEM and the arts, which many are now calling STEAM, because we know, especially under the next generation science standards, that we have an actual definition for science and engineering and a nature of the relationship between science and engineering, and that being scientists really seeking to ask questions and solve them through the use of experimentation, and engineers seeking to use that knowledge to solve problems. And I think what's often overlooked in this relationship is the role of communication and in the role of how that communication helps scientists, helps engineers, and really accelerates this sort of STEM cycle that we see. And so our special guest here today is Dr. Stephen Immerman, president of the Montserrat College of Art in Beverly, Massachusetts. Steve has an interesting background that crosses art, science, and education. Prior to his current appointment as president of Montserrat College of Art in 2009, he served 30 years at MIT, where he was an active and celebrated member of the MIT community. Among his many accolades, Steve received the MIT Excellence Award and was elected as an honorary member to the MIT Association of Alumni. His most recent role at MIT was as Senior Associate Dean for Student Development. Steve holds a Doctor of Education from the University of Pennsylvania, certificates in leadership from MIT, and in management from the Sloan School of Management at MIT, a Master of Science and Education from the University of New York, Albany, and a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the State University of New York, Potsdam. In 2015, our present Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker appointed Dr. Immerman to the Massachusetts Cultural Council. He also serves on many community and national boards, including the board of the Massachusetts Creative Network Commission and the Association of Independent Colleges of Art and Design. We're really honored to have Dr. Immerman here with us to discuss the deep connection between the next generation of scientific thinking and the role of art as we consider what it means to shift from STEM to STEAM. So Steve, thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here.
So I think to kind of get our discussion going, I have a couple shots of MIT, the MIT Dome and Simmons Hall that looks a bit like a cross between a snip of code and almost a piece of a robot or something. It's art and science, but can you tell us a bit about how your time at MIT and connects to your role now, how it led you to become sort of part of this art community?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and that's a really great way to start the conversation. A lot of my work at MIT was involved in institutional change, large-scale problem solving. As MIT evolved quite dramatically from when I first got there, which was relatively speaking, it's still MIT, but relatively speaking, it was, a domestic engineering school, and became really a major international science and engineering university. In that time period, of course, I had the opportunity to interact extensively with scientists and engineers, and really was immersed in the culture of the university, but also was immersed in the science and the politics and the strategy of institutional change, which always fascinated me. In that same time period, I also was involved fairly extensively in the arts, mostly around the edges, because it's not necessarily as central as some other things at MIT, but very much, and saw the connections quite clearly about the process of how artists conceive and execute their work, and how engineers and scientists do their work. And there weren't appreciable differences, and we can talk about that at some length later if we choose to. When the time came to leave MIT, as a product, aside from the time I spent trying to figure out what I was sort of good at, and trying to figure out, how not to lie to myself about that, and what really filled my soul, and trying to make sure I wasn't over-romanticizing that, it became evident that that it wasn't so much about what I needed or wanted, but rather, for lack of a better way of saying it, who needed me as a product. And this wonderful gem of an art college in Beverly, Massachusetts, was poised and had a board ready to, and a faculty and a staff ready to want to take on some pretty substantial change. And so it was a good fit. Just on the technical side, it was a good fit, but the real substance of the fit was the culture and the values, and how people treated each other, and how they cared about the students, and the personal individualized attention that students received to have a transformational educational experience. And that was what really drew me. You're going to work hard no matter where you are, but if you have a place that you can apply your efforts that also aligns with your values, you've hit the jackpot. And so that's how we got to Montserrat from MIT.
Well, that's great. So Montserrat College of Art is a 4-year residential college of visual art and design, right?
Yes.
And you have a very attractive student-teacher ratio. I think it's something like 4-to-1. And I mean, as a resident of the North Shore myself, I have an opportunity to pass by the college often. And I mean it as a compliment to say, when I've come to know Montserrat's reputation to be a college of choice, and really as an artist's college in a sense, I know that one of the things that's talked about often is about creating an environment for creative risk-taking. How do you do that at Montserrat College of Art when you are talking about this kind of community and values that bring you all together?
Well, most independent art colleges have a strong culture of critique, and it is constant. It's constant feedback. But that critique, because so much of an emerging artist's what they bring to the table also has to do with them finding their voice and getting themselves grounded. It's not just about the tools. You can learn the tools almost anywhere. As a matter of fact, that's one of the great fallacies that folks that think they're not artistic. You've heard people say, I can't draw a stick figure. The truth is everybody can, and it's because people draw what they think they see rather than what they see. And learning how to see is one of the base attributes of the freshman year experience at Montserrat. But that culture of critique, almost by definition, has to be executed in a way that's not personal, because you're bringing so much of who you are to the table, while as late adolescent in traditionally aged student populations, while students are trying to discover who they are and what they want to say. And so the maintenance and the fueling of that critique culture in a way that is professional and is helpful and supportive and provides feedback in combination with that faculty-student ratio allows us to be very personal and to maximize the potential of every student. That culture is largely preserved and maintained by our faculty. And so our greatest responsibility is, when we hire a faculty member, to make sure that they are people that are willing to invest in that culture and share the same values. And that's kind of how it happens. Allowing the student to find themselves, to work and rework, just like the experimental method, to go over and over and over again. Studio practice undergraduates involved in studio practice spend enormous amounts of hours producing every day. Whether the muse strikes or not, you have to crank it out. And that iteration with feedback creates an environment that makes it much safer to be able to make mistakes and to see what happens. And through that process, solve problems, visual communication problems, and see what works. And eventually you get your feet under you to be able to use the tools in ways that are much more facile and consequently can solve much more complex visual communications problems. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. You know, when we last spoke, you told me something that changed my thinking forever, and I doubt you had any sense that that this sort of transformation happened for me.
I gotta be careful what I say.
You have to be real careful. Somebody just might run with it. So you said art is engineered communication, and that changed my thinking entirely about what art is. And I would consider myself to be somebody who was a fan of art. You know, I saw value in it, but I don't know I really saw value in it until you made the statement. So I was wondering if you could expound a bit on what you mean by engineered communication, because you've been talking already about this idea of solving visual communication problems. But what does that mean, engineered communication?
Sure. So, you know, you think about what, you know, folks stereotypically think about in terms of an engineering problem, a bridge or a building. And, you know, to oversimplify it, the language and the technology is a lot of math and a lot of physics that help you do the analysis that breaks the problem down into parts, typical engineering or scientific approach, which is analytical. And therefore solve some kind of a problem that has to be solved in the, let's call it in the physical environment or in the biotechnical environment, same kind of a thing. The process is exactly the same in art. It's just that there's a different toolkit. So before we get into the toolkit, let's just remember, let's remind ourselves that everything that you encounter in your life is designed by somebody with some sort of intent to solve some sort of a problem. And I sometimes use this example when we have an open house and parents are here, and with some, you know, some trepidation, they're wondering what their son or daughter is going to do with an art degree. And I say, you know, tonight, this may be oversimplified, but tonight go home and open the refrigerator and just look at how much art is in your refrigerator. The labels on the products, the designs of the packaging, everything that you encounter. You know, look around your office space, those that are listening online, the chairs, the colors, the wall, the lighting, all designed by somebody who had some intent, that problem that needed to be solved. You know, we all drive cars. They all work exactly the same way, more or less. Some have some features that some don't, but basically they all work the same way. Why'd you buy the car you bought? You know, it might have been a price point, but on average we've fallen in love with the design of cars and what it communicates visually. So instead of physics and math, we use, you know, line and shape and form and value, space and color and texture and rhythm and balance and emphasis, and on and on and on and on and on. And so it is taking what it is, either your own idea that you want to communicate, using that toolkit to engineer a message, or as a commercial artist, you're taking somebody else's problem that they want a solution to and providing a set of engineered solutions that allow whatever message that they want to deliver to be executed and delivered. And so it's far more technical and far more intentional than I think a lot of the general public may stereotypically think when it comes to their idea of artist. You know, the lone artist sitting in the garret, painting some sort of abstract image that art is everywhere. Every TV show you watch, every magazine you open, every commercial that you see, every web page that you encounter, your cell phone with embedded video, photography, graphic design, illustration, user experience, user interface design, all of it done by an artist somewhere, someplace. And so it's very much engineered. It's just a different toolkit than what we typically think about in terms of engineering.
Mm. And I love your example of different cars, because that was something I was thinking about the other day in terms of at any given price point for a vehicle, you have different options, but you typically have more than one option. And oftentimes, if if you were to picture luxury vehicles at a particular price point, perhaps you could pick a BMW, or you could pick a Mercedes, or you could pick any number of particular luxury vehicles, but they're all so differently designed, but really designed to communicate something to the buyer, or maybe perhaps the buyer may use it as a symbol of something that they value as well.
Yeah.
Which
clothing does that in massive kinds of ways. People, why'd you wear what you wore this morning? There's certainly utility, right? And that utility has importance, but that utility is also designed into it. But on large part, we dress in ways that are trying to deliver a message, either who we are or what we want to say.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd not thought about clothing. Thinking about that kind of, you mentioned about sort of the freshman experience, thinking about the transition from students coming from K-12 art experience to freshman college art experience, and how you have now this culture of critique, and also this definition of engineered communication. Do you see or sense a readiness gap in particularly maybe the areas of what art is, or the risk-taking when it comes to the pool of potential applicants?
Well, it would be hard to generalize because in the first instance, and again, this is, on average, but in the first instance, students that intend to go to independent colleges of art and design that are studio-based are a self-selecting population. So sure, there's always gaps to be filled because everybody comes with different preparation and different skills. And a lot of times the students are not hugely educated about the options and alternatives that are the multitude of options and alternatives that are available to them post-graduation. So there certainly is a preparation issue, but we screen for that preparation issue in the application process, which is not wholly different, but enough different than the normal application process to be able to hedge your bets on readiness. And let me just talk about how we sort of do it here. Almost all colleges of art and design require a portfolio. And so in a portfolio submission, which is fairly extensive, there's an opportunity to interact with the individual. And so believe it or not, we know all our students before they're admitted. And we've sometimes had several conversations with them, maybe more than one portfolio review. We've seen them in high schools, high school classroom, and like I said, they tend on average to self-select. And so what we're looking for is, first of all, do they have the passion and the will to commit the amount of work that it requires to get through art college? I couldn't have done it as an undergraduate. These students are 6 hours of studio a day, plus then a liberal arts class, and then they got homework. And all of our students also have part-time jobs. And so part of the portfolio review is, have they had enough training and ability, and will they be able to sustain the effort that is going to be required to produce the level of work that studio-based BFAs require. The second is obviously academics. because of our earlier conversation, it's intuitive to us, but not to everyone, that art is mostly about ideas. And do they have the capacity to be able to manipulate ideas and to research ideas and to be able to write about ideas? If you cannot write, you really cannot succeed anywhere. If you can't tell your own story, you can't tell somebody else's. And so, are there basic attributes and basic capacity to engage the level of writing and the level of intellectual discovery that you have to do in concert with your studio practice? And then the final sort of cap it all off is, how do those things come together in attitude? Are they willing to fiercely commit themselves to this practice? Which, there are a certain number that get here and decide this isn't for them because it is so much work. So sure, there are gaps, but that's the kind of the stock and trade of what's going on in K through 12 these days. But because of the application process, on average, we're able to screen for those gaps in ways that relatively mitigate deficiencies. Every person comes with different skill sets, and so everybody, because the foundation year is at all independent colleges of art and design is fairly similar, there's the opportunity to have folks catch up. And in that context, because it's individually delivered, we are able to, again, individually design educational path for each student consistent with their own strengths and weaknesses. This, to me, is the way education should be done. It's highly inefficient, a lot of pressure financially to standardize, but as long as I'm here and as long as I think Montserrat and other art colleges believe what they believe, there will be a great emphasis on that individual approach to education.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting
long answer to a short question. Sorry.
No, that was a good answer though. That culture of critique, especially in ways that aren't personal, but something that is more one-on-one, you could see how that's not something that lends itself to automation, for lack of a better term. And it's interesting too. You mentioned the importance of writing and ideation, if you want to call it that, and the ability to tell a story and intellectual curiosity and the ability to sustain research and sort of that discovery process. And I think about English language arts, which we always refer to as K-12 educators, but that arts piece that's on the back of it, I think sometimes gets a little lost, especially as I think myself in elementary educator context, where we're trying to teach students the basics of reading and writing. And there's so many sort of canned reading and writing programs that we don't necessarily think about something written as reflecting the author's life and experience and views. And then perhaps I wonder if that is something that kind of follows in that kind of experience a little bit further for students as well, such that it's possible to have something that we call English language arts, but perhaps forget that back to your point of engineered communication, that's something that's written to make a statement. Hopefully.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, those of us that are addicted to reading, it's all recreationally. It's either about the story or it's about the form, and it is a very technical vocation to be able to write and to write effectively, and more importantly, to be able to write in a way that communicates. You think about advertising, and you got a 30-second spot, and somebody had to write it, and you know it when it works, and you know it when it doesn't. So that storytelling, the narrative, is so central to all art and all design. It's that you have to you have to think about it first in terms of the words. Especially if you're going to be in commercial design or commercial arts, you're going to negotiate your deals by words. You're going to get your instructions by words. You're going to get feedback by words. You know, it's central. It's critical to the process. And like I said, the narrative. We are born storytellers. But if we remember that something like, if I remembered it correctly, something like 60% of your brain is dedicated to tasks associated with vision. And some may be processing, it may be hand-eye coordination, you know, that kind of thing, and then some 30% just in processing visual information. You know, it's an enormous part of who we are and what it means to be human. And the extent to which then we have to, because language is also hardwired, we have to try to make meaning. It is impossible for us not to try to make meaning, and we are meaning-making animals. And so it is constantly that interaction of the visual and the meaning-making, and the meaning-making is all defined by words. If you don't have a word for something, you don't know what it is. It's just hardwired in. And that's why we have whatchamacallits and who's he what's-its and what's her name. You know, you have to have a word for it to be able to understand it. And so the two things are tied together inextricably.
And I think too, oftentimes, from an educational standpoint in a K-12 classroom, we're often under pressure from testing or scheduling or IEPs. There's so many different elements to juggle, multiple disciplines and everything. But that can almost become a focus on we're doing sort of we need to read 10 pages a day or you know, these 15 vocabulary words or something like this. But maybe in an art context, the what is oil on canvas or, you know, particular stone sculpture or, you know, medium, I guess is what I'm saying. But that idea, it sounds like, is the why. And then and I was thinking about this in the context of what you were saying with, you know, communication on the job and everything else. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And so that how is that bridge between the idea and the actual, I guess, expression of it in the end. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, you just oversimplified. You just described the last 1,000 years debate on what makes art good. You know, from Aristotle to the present. You know, at least what I've read, it starts with the actual physical object and how well it's executed and what we commonly agree to as standards in the quality of that execution. And then the second part is, what does it say? How does it communicate? And of course, nowadays, you have to add on who says it's good.
So, you know, one of the pieces I wanted to ask you about is something that is, you know, Pablo Picasso's Guernica, that, you know, not maybe the fine-tuned, you know, what's behind it, but really I wanted to ask, since everybody has heard by and large of Pablo Picasso and has seen Guernica in some form, some place, how would a piece like that fit into this definition of art as engineered communication?
Well, I think we all know it was intentional. His creation of that painting was intentional to describe the horrors of war, and it has a vocabulary that is, you know, what we today recognize as Pablo Picasso. I'm reminded of for those that haven't seen his early work, that he was trained as a very traditional artist. And most people think of it as Cubism and the very abstract stuff that was popularized. But for those that haven't experienced his early work, they really ought to take the opportunity to look at the depth and breadth of his talent and the numbers of experiments that he went through from a very early age to his to what we think about him today. Because it's all based in the same strong traditional training to get to the level of expression that painting exhibits. And so the colors that he chose, the images, the violence, the edges, the symbolism of the Nazis and so forth in the painting, all toward the end of him trying to deliver a message, and in some ways probably dealing with his own horror, his own internal angst about the art. So it very much as a focused piece of expression is engineered communication, very intentional, and at the same time very powerful in terms of the emotional content. So yeah, it's a classic example, and of course there are thousands and thousands of equally classical examples of some of which are because we've lost the language of some of the older paintings. We don't know what the symbolism means, that were quite contemporary at the time in terms of their symbolic content, right up to ones where we are much more familiar with what the symbolic content is and how do you make sense out of it. And of course, the more you learn about it, the more the paintings or the artworks have meaning and have a richness of meaning and depth of meaning as you become more. It's just like a person knowing about music. The more you know about it, you hear differently. Same thing with art. The more you look, you see differently. And it reminds me of a story. I tell this to first-year students. I don't know, in Basel or someplace, doesn't really matter the story. And my wife and I were walking through a museum that was filled with late works of Picasso. And I'd kind of had my fill. I didn't mean to be jaded or sound jaded, but yeah, I kind of had my fill. I'd seen enough. And I turned a corner, and there was one of his early works, one of the absinthe drinkers that he had done. This one was the one in green. And it was so strong and so emotional and so powerful, it literally nearly dropped me. And the point of the story that I tell is that it's important to keep looking. It's important to keep open and keep experiencing and keep learning, so that the quality of the experience continues to evolve and enrich over time, and to not just assume that you know, but to keep looking and keep trying to find meaning.
And I found it really interesting that when I had an opportunity to see this work in person, and at the time really knew very little about it, and then to learn more and more that while, and for those who may not be familiar with some of the backstory, that Pablo Picasso was living in exile. He was commissioned, and feel free to correct me here if there's any fine-tuning needed on this, but he was commissioned to create a work of art for the International Art Exhibition, I believe, in 1937, thereabouts, and he abandoned his sort of early drawings and decided to make a statement about the bombing, the Germans and Italians on the town of Guernica, and basically was able to insert this statement into that exhibition. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I did read somewhere that when the fascists found out about it, they asked him, what did you do? And he said, I didn't do it, you did. And if that's indeed true, I think to me that really sums up the potential power of art in sort of as part of a public conversation, really, even though it's something that's an object.
Well, it pervades. It's pervasive in all that we do, and all our culture is really dominated. You think about what Star Wars has done, or the characters in Star Wars, or that have become, or lines out of movies that are common to our culture now. One of the great things about America is the melting pot of ideas and art that have morphed and combined in ways. Jazz is a great example, that have enriched our lives and we ought not forget about the quality of life issues that are associated with art and design. It just makes our human experience better, and consequently, your points about K through 12 and the investments that are or are not being made in helping students learn that expression in a different way really diminishes the capacity of future generations to invest in quality art and design. It just makes our lives better, and we should be paying more attention to it. We should be investing more. I know it's an editorial, but obviously I strongly believe it.
And I want to come back to that idea in a moment. What you mentioned about culture is something which you may be familiar with, the kind of popular book by Lynn Nichols and the documentary The Rape of Europa, which outlines a number of stories behind sort of connecting World War II and art, and looking at sort of a lot of the ideas or situation that Monuments Men, the movie, portrays, but really at a much deeper level. And we could talk an awful long time just about this, but what struck me most in this documentary was how Hitler saw himself as an artist and used art and actually homogenized art and homogenized communication to his definition through propaganda, burning books, destroying paintings, even architectural choices, and so on, and really homogenizing society. And even in today's news, you can open the newspaper and you can find examples. ISIS destroying museums and millennial ruins and so on. And so when we think about, I guess, kind of that art as engineered communication, but also as a way of kind of anchoring society and kind of helping define our culture and give meaning and so on. This is a kind of a dark, I guess there's the positive and the negative side, and this is one of the incredibly dark periods. I guess, does this in some way, does the power of art really have something to do with its fundamental need in K-12 education? And when we're talking about the skills, you were talking about, there's the tools, but then there's also sort of a process, and you're going from an idea to an actual work that communicates something specifically. There's the person who's creating that, but then there's also the person consuming it.
Yeah, it's a conversation. That part is, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I get troubled, and I don't often speak about it, and I appreciate the opportunity to say something about it. About sort of teaching to the test, and not having much more project-based problem solving, whether it's art or whether it's science. When we codify, we run the risk of losing innovation. That's why you see so many technical companies now wanting, hiring artists, because the opportunity to include problem solvers that potentially think differently. Innovation is and creativity go hand in hand. There's no question about it. And one of the things that has been one of the great strengths of America, if you oversimplified it and compared it to, maybe what some stereotypically think about Japan. Japan's stereotypically, again, perhaps unfair, but has been great at taking other people's creativity and improving it. Whereas in the United States, we have an innovation economy that has been driving economic growth and development all around creativity and problem solving. When you remove the creativity and the process of training your brain to think in creative ways, you run the risk of homogenizing society to the point of losing our competitive advantage. And I don't think that's an overstatement. I don't think it's hyperbole. That's why, you have to be able to preserve the arts, and that's why you've seen progress this last year in the national curriculum to get it back in. When people are thinking of it as a luxury or thinking of it as an expense that can be jettisoned in K through 12 curricula, it really is central. It really is central as a form of communication, but more importantly as a way of thinking, because it is very much the central core of how we develop our culture. And not only has to be preserved, but losing the opportunity for students to gain the skill set of being able to interpret that culture and to be good consumers of that culture, and to be good evaluators and critical thinkers around that culture. When you're defining what is to be taught or what is to be thought, you lose. And so, it may be a reach, but an educated individual, as Jefferson said, is the best guarantor. The educated citizenry is the best guarantor of democracy. And when we have potential of presidential candidates that are, by some people's standards, the closest thing we've seen to in a long time to fascism, you need to be concerned about it. And again, I don't want to be hyperbolic or overstate it, but as members of society, we have a responsibility to leave the next generation better off than what we found it. And I think we run the risk of losing that capacity by homogenizing and standardizing educational standards. We have absolute standards at Montserrat. It's not a free-for-all. Every class has learning outcomes. Every class has specific objectives that a student has to be able to demonstrate. There's pedagogy that is ground through by our faculty review committees, intensely reviewed. There's outcomes that every student has to achieve before they can move on to the next. So it's not a free-for-all. There are standards, but within those standards, the ability to freely create and to express yourself is not abridged.
And I think your point about the innovation and creativity and having a healthy art appreciation as well as community of artists is so vital. Those skills, I think about it as really divergent thinking. STEM innovations are divergent. Something like Facebook, something like Uber, something like particular immunotherapies for cancer, artificial hearts, and so on. Somebody at some point thought differently about an issue, and it was divergent, and it was disruptive, and probably unpopular to the folks who were, solving that problem less adequately, perhaps. And I think about that in the context of the arts too, because, I think as your point about innovation and creativity, there's folks who, they're putting messages out there at times that are not, they're divergent. So they're carving out a niche. They're creating a space. They are, sometimes they're frankly unpopular if it offends perhaps the wrong person, if that's the case. So, I think in the case right now for K-12 educators, most states in a STEM context are dealing with the transition to next generation science standards. And one of the issues that schools are facing and trying to overcome is the traditional model of science instruction and the perceived images that we have as a society of what science, technology, engineering, and math are, and having to kind of pivot that mental model. And a couple of the images I brought up here, it's interesting that one of the ways I like to think about the way that society views something is really through stock imagery. So if you look at stock images and you say, science class, what you see is students with lab coats and beakers and something that's smoking, and oftentimes, and it's like, if it's not that, it mustn't be science. And then same thing in the media. On the right kind of lower corner, there's students who are all gathered around a beaker and pouring some different colored fluids. So this must be science. And I think with these new standards and the idea that there are science and engineering practices, those skills that are specific to the discipline, and I think specific is a relative term, but it's moving folks away from this idea that the teacher is a sage who delivers content to students who have the role of absorbing and then recalling or mirroring back what was told to them. And I really respect the National Research Council and the partner states that were involved in developing these new standards, because I feel like that isn't science. That's not preparing students to be scientists. And what I hear you describing in the context of art is that art is not about just sort of a tool, draw a straight line, or, getting your color palette, balanced or something, perfectly. But it's so much more than that. It's actually thinking creatively, and the way in a science context I think about this is, and in the Next Generation Science Standard sort of frames it this way, it's students developing skills and using those skills to develop and use the content and actually develop and use the discipline. And so the role of that instructor, and I think that's perhaps some of what you're saying too, around this culture of critique. And I don't get the sense in a culture of critique that everybody, you have an instructor that gets up and perhaps draws something and everybody draws the same exact thing. Correct. That it's something different. So in science, we often talk about teachers as the coach and as helping students understand how to engage appropriately and helping to kind of redirect and monitor. How similar or dissimilar is that from what is going on in a quality art instructional setting?
Yeah, so very much describe the next generation. The faculty member is mentor, coach, advisor, guide, certainly instructor, because there are technical aspects of when you're teaching perspective, there are concepts that basically have to be practiced, but it's very much a flipped classroom kind of a setting where students are in studio 6 hours a day and they're producing, and the faculty members walking around and advising each individuals about the choices they're making. And what were they thinking about that choice, and what was the effect of that choice, and are there different ways to think about it? So it's very much what you described about taking a toolkit, learning a toolkit, and then you're learning to apply it. I mean, if you want to have feel good about the future of America, last night I was at our pitch contest with 8 teams of undergraduates that had business ideas derived explicitly from their perspective as artists, that each one of them had some art component, but they were straight ahead, clearly business ideas that they were pitching to a panel for feedback. And it was all about thinking differently. Certainly, there's analysis like traditional science and engineering, but there's also synthesis and looking at the larger objective and the customer experience and the market demand and innovation in improving the delivery of a service or a product around, in words, in ways that might be disruptive, to do something new and different that is going to improve the customer experience or improve the quality of what's being delivered. And so art education is very much what you described. It's about learning a set of tools and then using those tools in a coached kind of a way with the faculty to solve interesting visual problems. And in the case of the pitch contest last night, interesting business problems, every one of which was, no overstatement, was a great idea. Power of ideas.
It's interesting because what you described reminds me a lot of Steve Jobs. I think, um, you know, I think Steve Jobs was much more of an artist than he
Oh,
was
totally.
a
Are you
technologist.
kidding? It wasn't the cheapest product. It was a better design product.
Right.
Totally. Yep.
And he was
With
enamored with typeset and so many things.
yes, no question about it.
So with that idea that, again, I mean, we're already kind of coming to it here, this crossroads, it's, my images of sort of the stock photo of what science is, and then the sort of the science classroom. I I did the same exercise, and sure enough, top left, this is the sort of I would say the average image that you find in relation to art class and in sort of an elementary context. And then in the bottom right, what would be familiar to many folks, I think certainly in my experience is familiar to me.
Color wheels, yeah.
Exactly, the color wheel. So how is it that we I guess, take what we've said, sort of what I've described in this idea of the next generation model of science instruction, and what you're describing as the next generation, or perhaps the present, generation of art instruction, and, apply that to a K-12 art classroom. So is what you're describing this sort of culture of critique and the idea of students developing a toolkit and the coaching, is that something that's applicable to a K-12 art classroom? And let's even shift it downward. Let's say forget about high school, elementary, as early as elementary. Is that something that's applicable? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I don't think you can start early enough in getting students to think about ideas and to express those ideas and then to try to implement those ideas, regardless of whether it's the wood shop or it's the math class. But you can't divorce yourself from the toolkit as well. And so, there has to be a balance. And but you can imagine how it just sucks the energy and the life out of a classroom to have it be not relevant to the experience and the understanding of the students. And so my solution, if I won the lottery, I would have a curriculum that was 100 project based, and I would do the instruction on. You can get through the entire curriculum. Have students design something new. For little kids, it might be a toy. Toy design is a great career for a lot of our students. But for other students, it might be something they use every day. Design a new backpack, and you can get math and engineering and physics and material science and certainly the process of collaborative problem solving and teamwork and writing and research. All those things can be incorporated in a project-based curriculum. I think the worst thing in the world is to have us grind through at least what I experienced as 100 years ago in K through 12, of sitting there and memorizing and repeating back without thinking about the context and the applicability of what it was I was doing and how it might be used to make the world a better place. So I don't think you can start early enough getting people facile with how to use their ideas and how to take those ideas and put them into a form that then can be manipulated and acted upon.
And I think even, well, it's interesting that there's ideas, and then there's even really that intentional communication, which is maybe, I don't know if that's a subset of ideas, but to be able to actually express an idea through what you created.
And verbally. Yep.
It's
we expect
quite
all
something.
our students to be able to do both.
So in a K-12 context, and as the idea of STEAM has gained traction nationally, I've often been asked, what do you think about STEAM? And so as we get into conversation, and I'll often ask the person, how they define art. And the response that I often get is more or less, if I was to boil it down, making something aesthetically pleasing. And and again, it might take the form of, how can we take this car and make it aesthetically pleasing? We're going to build a little toy car, so STEAM means making the toy car aesthetically pleasing. But do you think that having a definition that's focused on aesthetically pleasing somebody could potentially threaten the arts in some way?
Well, I think that'd be going too far. I think it's one aspect that's a choice. There's certainly nothing wrong with things being aesthetically pleasing, even though beauty is subjective. We come to common understandings of what we think as a culture collectively all the time, whether it tastes good, whether it's beautiful, whether it's ethical. Those things tend to be relative over time. Some truths are eternal, but not too many. So there's nothing wrong with something being aesthetically pleasing, but it's certainly limiting. That's one aspect of, or one particular objective, or one problem to be solved depending on your tastes. But to have that be the sole purpose certainly would be a dangerous thing. There's so much more involved in whether it communicates and what it communicates, and there's plenty of art that I know is good, even though I don't like it. Doesn't mean it's not good art. It just doesn't happen to be my taste. And so
sure.
I would not necessarily call that out as a primary objective. No, I'd be much more interested in process and in thinking and choices and decision making and building the tools to be able to exercise the message and the story that wanted to be told. Certainly, there's an aspect of things being aesthetically pleasing, and there's a place for that. And certainly in my house, there's tons of things that are extremely aesthetically pleasing, and that art form is, important to me, and I value it. But it's just one aspect.
So as we're kind of rounding the corner to wrap up here, I want to let anybody know who's on the live session. If you have any questions, a few folks have asked questions already, please drop those in. There, you have a little spot where you can ask questions, probably on the right side of your screen, and I'll try to field 2 or 3 of those. But just as we're wrapping up, I guess, not to go into detail, but what I've pulled up right now are the science and engineering practices from the Next Generation Science Standards. And I just was wondering how you see some of these STEM practices as STEAM practices that perhaps a K-12 classroom, an art classroom, could incorporate perhaps in some of the same ways that you are at Montserrat.
Well, the analogies are almost one-to-one. Especially in commercial design, but asking questions, defining problems. Every commercial design is that. I need to market my new fill in the blank. How do I do that in a meaningful way that defines the market segment that I'm trying to attract? All art and design has, in terms of our ways that we understand visual language, all has models that help us understand and organize how we think and how we use those models. And oversimplified, it could be physical models or it could be visual models. But sculpture has certainly characteristics to it that is defined by models of design, and plenty of commercial design. Experimentation, thinking about what you're trying to achieve, and then trying it and fixing what doesn't work is the process of creating good art. So planning, carrying out investigations or experimentations, and then taking it apart. What part works, what doesn't? What I told you about critique in terms of analysis. This works over here. Why does it work? This doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? How do you interpret the data that you're seeing, and why isn't that working the way you think it ought to? I would say design thinking rather than mathematical and computational thinking, but there's a ton of math in art, just a ton. In relationships, and certainly in figure drawing, it's all math. In terms of the spatial relationships between parts of the body, and students have to learn that math. Uh, Engaging in argument from evidence, well, that's the critique process. And but from a commercial design standpoint, it's market research. How does this relate? How do people experience it? What's the data that says that this is working or it isn't? And obtaining, evaluating, communicating information. I mean, we've gone through that. We've covered that pretty. So it's almost one-to-one. It's just a different language and a different set of skills.
And I like that idea too. Right, and the tools just being, or the expression just being a different almost medium, I guess we might call it.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful and wonderful. I appreciate your insight, and I wish we had even more time to discuss these things, because as we're talking, the creating, evaluating, analyzing from that traditional Bloom's taxonomy, one of the things that we often talk about in the context of STEM is the idea that creating, evaluating, and analyzing almost happens simultaneously.
Yeah, and I would put synthesis in evaluation as well. I'd add that in there, because I think they're missing that. What's the whole? How do things come together? How do you put whole things together to create something new? Maybe it's in the creation block, but analysis and synthesis usually go hand in hand.
Absolutely, and I mean, you have the idea. How do you create against it, and then in that critiquing process, evaluate, analyze, and adjust. Yeah. So we've had a few questions, and I want to make sure grab one or two of these, and I want to also give a shout out to the college too, in the sense of you guys, I believe, have some community programs, don't you, as well? Or at least community nights.
Yes, our biggest one, which is a plug, straight ahead plug, is our annual auction, which is an open call, so it's students, faculty, and community members. Our annual auction is April the 2nd. It's going to be at in a warehouse at Gloucester Engineering at Blackburn Circle, and this is an experience not to be missed, in a gigantic space with art being made in the moment. And we typically limit tickets to 1,000 participants, and so I would encourage people, if they really want to see some remarkable art and be able to bid on it at auction prices, and to experience art that's contemporary and in the moment, absolutely go to our website and click on the auction.
That's wonderful. So can people bid online as well, or do they have to be in person?
They can't. They have to be there.
Okay. Well, make it over, and actually that's my wife's birthday, so maybe that's a good event for us to check out. So yeah, so we have some great questions here, a lot of positive reflections on things that were shared, comments you made. There's a few here that I think will be perhaps crossing a lot of different questions that have been asked. One is from I believe an educator who is teaching in lower economic area where folks can't afford art classes and supplies sort of on their own. Do you have any advice on how this educator or educators in this situation can build a for art or even STEAM? And she has some access to, it sounds like perhaps a makerspace, which I guess many folks probably wouldn't have. But just if you picture that setting, what would be your recommendation?
Well, there's a lot of, my recommendation was to look at design thinking and to look at the process of thinking about art. And, materials don't have to be expensive. They can be everyday materials. They can be materials that are brought from home. Egg cartons are, remarkably useful in creating works of art. But the process of using those materials and thinking about what is it that you're trying to achieve, what's the idea, and then experimenting with how those materials come together to create a form, and then thinking about the form and what does it mean, and did it work or not. And so having said that, there are lots of places that that engage art in lower socioeconomic environments where students can have access to it. But I wouldn't be so constrained about materials. I'd think about found everyday items that might be in everyone's home. Um, uh, Paper towel, that cardboard piece in paper towel, or simple ink that's not hugely expensive. So we've got lots of ideas. If that person wants to be in touch, I connect them with some folks that are thinking about curricula and how to use simpler and less expensive, because certainly the cost is certainly an issue everywhere in the United States, not just in socioeconomically challenged neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And so if that person, if you'd like to reach out either perhaps through montserrat.edu, is there they can go through a contact form, or if they want to reach out?
Just write me.
Okay.
Write me. It's okay. I'll get into the right person.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll connect that person up then. The next question I wanted to send your way here is from another educator who, or perhaps a parent who said that they feel as though they traded their artistic ability when they, used to be able to sketch wonderfully for a science and math ability, kind of a math brain, and they feel like they've lost some of that ability. How can they encourage their students, so it must be an educator here, their students as well as their own children to maintain both?
Yeah, and so I don't want to oversimplify, but because everybody has a certain upper limit of emotional and intellectual energy, but it's just practice. It really is practice.
Are there any particular venues that you would recommend of some type for that?
There are tons of community opportunities to take classes. There's online courses and online opportunities to experiment and to try art. Sometimes it just is going to museums more regularly and experiencing, being immersed in getting that part of your brain reconnected. It's almost limitless, but it is the practice, and the practice is important. It's just like, I can hardly play the piano anymore because I'm out of practice. I mean, it's in there, and if I worked at it enough, it would come back. But practice is critical.
That absolutely makes perfect sense. I know if this person is in the California region, especially Bay Area, creativity.org, the Children's Creativity Museum in the Yerba Buena Gardens in San Francisco, has some resources online, but also some great resources that you can go visit as well. And then there are so many questions. I'll take maybe one more, and let's see here. So there's several that sort of are together saying, resources, kind of two parts here. One being, can you speak to the role of visual arts and sort of physically creating in terms of developing the spatial skills required for engineering skills? I know there's been some research about that. Was there anything that you would?
Well, I can speak generally. I'm certainly not an expert, but it makes sense. Our ability to manipulate and our ability to do hand-eye coordination, but it's I would focus more on the thinking, the process, the seeing. I was surprised to learn, but it's intuitive. I was surprised to learn that in the continuing education that physicians are required to do, that art classes qualified. And the logic was, there's a big program of this at Columbia, the logic was that it helps physicians be better with their bedside manner and their observation skills, that they see better when they practice building and looking and drawing. And so it would make sense that there is a direct relationship to intellectual development and the parts of the brain that generalize from one particular application to another. But again, I'm not an expert on it. I'm guessing there are people who are.
Sure. And I know there is a report that was looking at Legos and actually sort of some of the gender gaps in STEM sort of career pathways and those who perhaps choose a STEM career versus those that don't. And early boys' toys was actually one of the pieces that they highlighted, looking at boys being encouraged to work with things like Legos and how it had an effect on visual spatial reasoning versus girls that were not encouraged or perhaps discouraged in some cases. But the last piece, and I know that you have been involved with a number of efforts locally and I think also nationally when it comes to the STEAM conversation, the role of arts and science, technology, and engineering. And what I don't want to let you go without asking, because several folks are asking about this, how can, let's say, community members, if that's different, but educators as well, how can they kind of connect up and help support the STEAM conversation, and what are the efforts that they could perhaps participate in?
Well, there is at the national level, there is a congressional caucus on STEAM, and so they could find out whether their representative is a member of the caucus, and they could write them to encourage them to join the caucus. There's a ton of links online of STEM to STEAM. Many of my colleague institutions are also deeply involved in local efforts. They can be involved in their school committees in encouraging the preservation and the inclusion of arts in K through 12 curricula. But again, if they really want to get connected to it, a simple Google search will probably surface many more options than I could list. But it's engaging and talking about it and watching and making sure that creativity and innovation understand, those folks that are involved in creativity and innovation understand that that the arts have a central role in helping us maintain and expand our creativity.
Absolutely.
As well as economic development. We all, there's another whole hour on economic development.
Oh, absolutely. And I wish we had time for even more questions because we have a bunch, but we will, if you haven't had your question answered, we'll do our best to follow up with you. You can reach out to us and we'll connect you with Dr. Immerman. There's a contact us link on the KnowAtom.com website, and I'm sure if you go to montserrat.edu, you can contact Dr. Immerman, write him right through the resources there as well. There's been a few questions about will this presentation be available online after this? Yes. So there are a few ways you can stay connected. You can go to facebook.com/KnowAtom, Twitter @KnowAtom, and this event as well as others are available on KnowAtom.com/resources. So you can check there. We'll also send folks a link to the recording of this session in a follow-up email. So Steve, I've learned an awful lot, and I appreciate even more now what you do and how an art education is coming together, at least at Montserrat, under your guidance. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's my very great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
I'd also like to thank everyone who has joined us. Thank you for your time. And again, if you would like to share this with a friend, it'll be available online, free, and on demand if you go to KnowAtom.com/resources. And we will also get the folks at Montserrat a link as well that they can post on their site.